live on Indo-Japan Pulse FB. Okay. Thank you, friends, for joining this first business webinar by Indian IT Association Japan, which is shortly called as ITAJ. As most of you might know, that Indian IT Association was formed to facilitate interaction among Indian IT entrepreneurs and also to resolve any collective issues that we may face. First of all, let me thank our Indian Embassy for all the support they have rendered for ITAJ and especially this event. Our Honorable Ambassador was expected to give the keynote speech live, but due to his busy schedule, he has sent us a recorded message of the speech, which I'll be playing soon. As a part of our activity today, we have two eminent guests, Mr. Pankaj Arjunwadkar, partner at Deloitte, and Mr. Rajat Ranjan, Managing Director at Deloitte. Welcome, Pankaj-san. Welcome, Rajat-san. Okay, topic of the day is Japan's technology transformation, opportunities for Indian service providers, and some tax nuances. I think last time there were a lot of questions about tax or cross-border taxation and all the stuff. So that is why we have requested people from Deloitte to give us the insight into how to handle those things. So before we actually go with the speakers, I would like you to listen to our ambassador, our Honorable Ambassador's speech. Okay, so I would like to share the Ambassador's speech.
Mr. Pankaj Arjunwadkar, partner at Deloitte Japan, Mr. Rajat Ranjan, Managing Director, Mergers and Acquisition, distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, namaskar, konnichiwa. At the outset, I would like to thank the Indian IT Association of Japan for this important initiative that brings forward the opportunities for Indian service providers as Japan pushes forward in its technology transformation. I sincerely hope that the webinar today will allow for further deepening in the understanding of Japanese industry and allow us to explore new avenues of cooperation. Warm greetings to all the participants of the event today. Friends, as you would be aware, we are celebrating 70 years of establishment of diplomatic relations between India and Japan this year. Over the course of these 7 decades, our partnership has strengthened and transformed into a spatial, strategic and global partnership. Japan today is one of India's most trusted and valued partners. India and Japan, as has been noted by our Prime Minister on different occasions, are natural partners. Our ties have been remarkable and has progressed in the last few years and covered a wide range of areas including trade and investment, industrial development, infrastructure, digital, energy, human resources, critical and emerging technologies, climate change, health security, space and defense. The annual summit held in India earlier this year between Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Kishida Fumio has infused the relationship with even greater energy and momentum. Earlier this month, both India's Defence and External Affairs Ministers visited Tokyo for the 2+2 dialogue and had a productive exchange of views with their Japanese counterparts. With the easing of COVID-19 restrictions in India and Japan, we plan to continue the momentum of such high-level exchanges. Japan continues to play an important role in India's economic growth story. It is actively involved in various national campaigns and flagship initiatives of India. The expanse of our partnership extends into every socio-economic sector. Particularly noteworthy are infrastructure development, ICT and digitalization, energy, space, food processing, science and technology, healthcare, and research and development cooperation. New industrial collaborations are in the making even as we speak. Complementarity between the two countries can facilitate new, innovative, and alternate models of partnership. To make this possible, both countries need to come together to co-innovate, co-create, and co-produce for both domestic and indeed the global markets by combining their strengths and competitiveness. One of the focus areas, as put forward by Prime Minister Kishida in his inaugural speech, is digital transformation. This also provides an immense opportunity for India to work together with Japan through cooperation in digital domain. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, as you might be aware, both countries have institutionalized cooperation in digital domain through the India-Japan Digital Partnership, which allows us to tap into synergies and complementarities between Japan's Society 5.0 and India's Startup India and Digital India programs. Japan has embarked on a number of reforms in digital governance and digital transformation. Under Digital India, we have implemented various key programs such as world's largest digital identification scheme known as Aadhaar, India Stack, which provides framework for financial inclusion, digital payment services by providing the UPI framework and identity verification based services, platforms for e-education, e-health, government procurement portal and smart farming, to name a few. For Indian IT companies such as those present today and other emerging startups, there is a big opportunity to work with Japanese small and medium enterprises in enabling their digital transformation. IIT-AJ can play a major role in this area to connect SMEs and Indian IT companies. As an embassy, we would be very happy to facilitate such initiatives from the industry. Digital cooperation is also closely tied to our skill development partnership. METI in Japan has recently launched the Asia-Japan Investing for the Future, AJIF in short, initiative under which the Japanese government will provide support for 50,000 highly skilled Asian professionals in digital technology and other in-demand fields to seek jobs in Japanese companies in Asia as well as in Japan over the next 5 years. India should be one of the major focus areas of this initiative, and we look at more Indian coming to Japan in coming years, particularly in the digital transformation segment. Let me briefly mention what the two countries have achieved so far in skilling and facilitating the movement of Indian workers to Japan. First, Japanese companies have set up 22 Japan-India Institute of Manufacturing and 8 Japanese endowed courses in India. Second, a memorandum of cooperation between Japan and India on specified skilled workers is facilitating movement of workers from India to Japan in 14 categories of specified skills. This adds to the progress made under the Technical Intern Training Program. It is also good to note that several tech companies from Japan like NEC, NTT, Rakuten and Hitachi have made India as their research and development hub and have created employment for thousands of highly skilled Indian personnel. While we have made remarkable progress, more can be done. We need to continue our efforts towards synergizing India's demographic dividend and Japan's capital and technology. A stronger skill development partnership will pave the way for greater mobility and movement of skilled personnel between the two countries. This brings me to the end of my remarks. I wish to once again thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I hope that today's webinar will culminate into deeper understanding of Japan and lead to creating the new avenues to collaborate with each other. Thank you very much. Dhanyavad. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Yes,
Hi everyone, my name is Pankaj and I lead the global inbound group for Deloitte Tomatsu in Japan. So there are around 325 large and medium inbound companies based in Japan, and there's a significant amount of work that comes, from these accounts. And I get an opportunity to walk the corridors with the CEOs and the CFOs and the CIOs of these companies. And I'm happy to share the pulse, what's going on in Japan economy, and also give you a perspective of what is in store for IT companies or IT service providers in Japan. So maybe for the first 30 minutes, we cover that perspective. and then we get into the the other topics, which is basically some nuances in taxation, so on and so forth. So let me get going on. Okay, so basically, when we talk about the opportunities that you see in Japan, I mean, there are going to be these top five. There are these top five areas that that come to picture, and this is basically when we talk to our clients. Cloud would probably be the topmost on the agenda. So I do get an opportunity to talk with Google, AWS, Azure, so on and so forth. And according to their global plans, Japan is amongst the top 3 for them as a market. So you can imagine the kind of opportunities that are in store when it comes to cloud computing. And for Japan, it's the next big thing. So you, as an IT service provider based in India, or you already have establishment in Japan, that is one area you definitely need to look into. The other area that is probably in the periphery would be cybersecurity. A lot of opportunities have been seen in cybersecurity. So per se, if you look at the Japan as as an IT market, they are very, very conservative when it comes to cloud and cybersecurity. And that's where a lot of the clients get jittery about security. And if you are able to provide services around cybersecurity, I think you are absolutely in the right area. The number 3 and probably the most talked about is climate, environment, sustainability, and governance. So ESG, if you look at Japan's commitment to climate, the commitment is by 2030, we are looking at a reduction of carbon emissions of around 46 to 50%. And they're very serious about it. It means that a lot of investments are going to go into ESG. So I would definitely recommend people who are looking at new solutions to identify ESG as one of their offerings. Now, a lot of this ESG offering is going to be technology enabled, right? So if you want to be a market differentiator, you need to have solutions which are technology enabled solutions for ESG. Now, it means that, of course, reporting is obviously one of the key areas, but there are many other areas within the entire setup of an organization where you require ESG. And data is going to be very key when it comes to computing of ESG, whether it's carbon emissions, carbon footprints, or even monetizing carbon emissions. It's very important that you have a robust offering around ESG. So that's one area definitely on cards. The next one that is obviously making rounds is 5G, much faster in terms of processing as well. So that's one area again that we are looking at, which is definitely going to make big rounds when it comes to opportunities for Indian IT service providers. Now, if you look at the entire ecosystem, and if you look at it from an industry perspective, we have started seeing a significant change when it comes to mobility and transportation, obviously cars, and this is over and above the semiconductors, market that we are talking about. We are talking about driverless cars. We're talking about electric cars. So though there is a buzz that, hey, it's going to take time in terms of electric cars coming to Japan, you will be surprised. A lot of activity is going on. So when we talk to our global and also the Japanese OEMs, there's a lot of investment that is going on there. So if you are an IT service provider around that, I believe you are in for some good business over there as well. Robotics in agriculture. Now this is very very niche, and if you as a service provider, I know I have been a part of the Indian Embassy initiatives when it comes to entrepreneurship and investments. There have been a lot of agro-based startups who have pitched for, say, work in Japan. And I think robotics in agriculture is going to be the next big thing. Agriculture is around 1% of Japan's GDP. And if you look at the potential, it is significant. And especially with the aging population, you're going to see a significant investment in robotics when it comes to agriculture. Now, when you look at business, jobs, and education, that's of course when we talk about future of work, a significant number of current jobs will disappear. A lot of new jobs will come, will actually be created, and that's one space. We can talk for hours around future of work, but that's one very prominent change that you're going to see in the Japan market. 3D printing and manufacturing, again, with the 3D printer prices going down, we will see a significant change in the landscape when it comes to these areas. Now, what are these exponential technologies that are going to make an impact in the Japan market? And for me, I believe it's the octagon of exponential. That's the way we put it. We are talking about the octagon of exponential, right? So when we talk about, say, certain exponential technologies like, say, robotic process automation. So RPA has been there for the last 5-10 years, right? But if you look at the next continuum in automation, we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about chatbots, we are talking about natural language generation, so on and so forth. So if you look at the continuum over here, we are talking about mobility, visualization. These are basically the tools which are going to take you, going to make your data look much better. Now, I think the third one, which is going to be very, very critical, is in-memory computing. Now the other, the simplest, say, word that you find for in-memory computing, which is a buzzword, is basically S/4HANA, right? So I had a couple of meetings with the SAP team very recently, and they said that the demand for SAP for the next 5 years is around 20,000 resources in Japan. And currently there are only 9,500 professionals, SAP professionals in Japan. So there's a significant gap there. Now, especially with 2030 not too far, where SAP is going to discontinue its support for the current versions, S/4HANA is going to be the next big thing. And in every market, it's not only Japan, but in every market. So if you are a service provider around SAP, I would definitely encourage you to develop that area, and that's going to be selling like hotcakes. Now, blockchain is one kid which we thought would do wonders, but somehow it has taken the back seat. But blockchain as a documentation tool is still around the corner. But of course, with lot of other technology transformations happening, the business case for blockchain, the ROI is not still being established. We are not able to establish an ROI for that. Robotic process automation obviously has been around for long. A lot of financial institutions, a lot of consumer products companies have already implemented RPA, and they have started getting the benefits as well. On your left-hand side is Internet of Things. Now, IoT, if you look at Japan as a landscape, Japan was amongst the top countries to use IoT. In fact, a lot of the smart manufacturing, smart factories, they definitely use IoT. So if you are into business which provides allied services around IoT, absolutely a great opportunity there. Now, what IoT does is it basically collects a lot of information and data. And when we talk about data as a service or data analytics, IoT plays a very important role because they are all connected through devices. So if you are a service provider or a service provider looking forward to actually getting deeper into the Japan market, IoT is another area that you should look at. Now, cognitive computing. Now, this is one step ahead of, this is basically automation, but more intelligent automation. We are talking about machine learning, natural language generation, natural language processing, NLG, NLP, very, very critical. A lot of Japanese language NLG and NLP is now available. Chatbots are again very popular now amongst the Japanese companies. So this is one area you should definitely look into. And if you've got Japanese language capability, which adds on to your chatbots or intelligent automation, very, very important. It's an open market for you. Again, my favorite, analytics. I mean, if there's one area which is going to make big, it's going to be advanced analytics. And especially with, say, tools available like in-memory computing, data is now available, and it's good data that can be monetized. So very, very important that you have strong analytical tools which are going to help you use that data and take your organization to the next level. Can we move to the next slide, Rajat? Maybe we'll skip this in the interest of time, but if you look at the continuum, currently there's a lot of robotic buzz around robotic process automation in Japan. But as you move forward, we are going to see a lot of intelligent automation and artificial intelligence that is going to come into the entire automation continuum. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. So if there are these four areas, right? If I mean, basically we are talking about what are the levers for robust demand, and I'm going to link each of these to what opportunities our IT providers in India might have, right? So we are talking about history. So one slide down, please, Rajat. Okay. Now, historically, if you see, now this is very interesting, and people who have been following Japanese economy would resonate to this. From 1960 to 1975, Japanese economy grew in double-digit figures. So imagine an economy growing at 10-12% GDP. That's phenomenal, right? And if you look at 1988, it actually grew at 6.7%. And then from there, you can see that slide, right? So the years from 1990 to 2015 were actually lost decades. You know, they absolutely 25 years where very, very little happened in Japan. And that actually took them a few years behind. So what does that mean, right? So in Japan today, we are talking about 1.5% GDP growth rate. But remember, it's a $5 trillion economy, right? A $5 trillion economy with a growth rate of 1% is significant in terms of dollar value, right? So one click down, Rajat, you will basically see what are the basic, what are the levers that you find. Rajat, one slide down. So a lot of companies, we are seeing a leapfrog jump, right? So for long, organizations have not changed. So I still have clients who use the black screens for their finance and accounting, something which they had probably implemented in the mid-80s, and they're still continuing. But now it's the need for them to really move ahead. So some of them who are not even on an ERP system are now looking at a leapfrog jump, and they are looking at an S/4HANA solution, right? So good as well as bad. One, obviously, the challenge for them is getting into the groove, understanding the entire ecosystem, data, again, an aging workforce that they have. So that's going to be a challenge, but a leapfrog jump in IT in Japan, very much in vogue currently. And if you are an IT service provider, you would be licking your lips, right? Next is need to innovate to stay relevant. Japanese companies have for long, those 20-25 years, they have taken them back and they need to innovate. Third one, an aggressive economic measures. taken by the neighboring economies, and that is putting a lot of pressure on Japan. We have seen say countries like China, Korea doing much better in terms of innovation. And of course, you've got geopolitical reasons which are forcing you to take things to the next level. Can you move to the next slide, please? Let's look at demographics, and this is also a very, very interesting area. So in demographics, we are talking about, say, yeah, I mean, definitely would like to look into the statistics, right? And I'm sure you would have probably understood that around 29 to 30% of Japan's population today is over the age of 65, right? Now, what is more important is, if you click one down, Rajat, you'll find that between the age of 40 to 60, there's another 27% population. So imagine who are the people who really drive, drive IT transformation. It's basically, historically, if you look at the economies, it is the age group between 25 to 40. They are the ones who really drive IT transformation. Now, if you have one click down, please, if you have got 27 plus 29, 56% of population not really looking into that space, you would have that advantage of coming into this economy and making a difference. One slide down, please. So we are actually talking about at least, say, a basic opportunity for you to enter into this market, because the demand is high, investments are around the corner, and they don't have people to actually implement it. So it's a clear case for you to actually invest in Japan and make a fortune. Let's move on to the next one, please. Economics. Yeah, so let's talk about economics a bit. I mean, since I am a big fan of demographics and economics, I actually go deeper into the Japanese economy. For the past, say, 4.5, 5 years, I have been in Japan, and it has been a very interesting study for me. Studying the dynamics of economics in Japan. So if we go one slide down, we are actually talking about the trends in the Japanese economy, right? So if you look at current, we are talking about a $5 trillion economy, right? And if we actually identify what are the key levers for a $5 trillion economy, the breakup is very simple. And in fact, it is going to surprise you as to how this $5 trillion economy is actually spread out. So one click down, if you look, you're talking about, it's a very interesting spread, and you should actually ask a question to yourself. If it's going to be industry and manufacturing, it's an island nation. It does not really it does not have manufacturing hubs the way China or India has. It's actually 29% industry manufacturing contribution, which is fair. Now look at agriculture, it is 1%. Now, do you really know what the component of 70% services is? And that translates into $3.5 trillion. So a $3.5 trillion services economy, you should actually double click to understand what that is all about. So typically in India, a service oriented, say, economy would mean a lot of manpower, because it's a very clear math. You talk about, say, a revenue per person into into your working population, you can probably get an estimate of your services, right? The contribution to the GDP. But here it's a very, very different economics, and it's very interesting. So when I actually deep dive into this particular area, now if you look at the number of innovations and patents that happened in 1960 to 1990 approximately, right? Now the story goes this way. Every car manufactured in the world, every television manufactured in the world. Every mobile, every refrigerator, any electronic device that is manufactured in the world, Japan actually gets a royalty for it, right? So if you have to consolidate it all, it actually gets into services, right? So that is the secret for that $3.5 trillion coming from Japan. Now, there obviously, it means that there is history behind this. There is a lot of work that has gone, historically to make it a $5 trillion economy. But remember that a lot of these patents are actually for 99 years. So you will probably see a significant change in this unless Japan really starts innovating again. So can we click down to the next one? And that's where we come to our next point, which is research and development. Now, one click down, you'll see that Japan currently, they have realized that if they have to continue this particular trend of a $5 trillion economy, they will have to invest in R&D. So that's where opportunities for Indian IT companies come in again. So look at the global patents registered. It's almost amongst the top 3 in the world. Japan is right up there. So very, very important to note that IT service providers who are supporting the industry in terms of R&D, I think that there is a lot of opportunity, and I would definitely encourage you guys to look at that as one of your opportunities. Can we go to the next slide? Number of patents registered in Japan. So obviously in the earlier years, the number of patents that were registered were much higher. But even now, there is a significant amount of investment that is going in R&D. In fact, 3.5% of the GDP, Japan's GDP, goes in research and development. It means that they understand and value the trends that R&D can bring in. They understand the value of patents and royalties and intellectual property. So there is going to be a significant investment of this $5 trillion economy into research and development. Now, where the challenge lies for Japan is they have been investing in R&D, they have been applying for patents, but a lot of patents are not getting approved. Reason being, Japan, Korea, and other countries have already leveraged in the past 15, 20 years, and they have made a mark in the technology, especially when it comes to innovation. So now Japan is a bit struggling, you can say, in terms of winning those patents, but still they are in the race because, Japanese R&D is one of the best in the world, and they will be able to get, at least the innovative patents that they are looking at. So this is one area the economy will be definitely looking to invest. And as IT service providers, you do have a significant opportunity in this area. Can we go one down? So this is a composition of the R&D expenditure. A lot, of course, goes into manufacturing of transportation equipment, the likes of Toyotas, Hondas, Nissans, Mitsubishis, Daihatsus of the world. They are actually investing heavily, and especially with electric cars, driverless cars, there's a lot of innovation happening in that area as well. Again, for me, medicine, the life sciences, still Japan does hold an edge. There's a lot of investment happening there. And then if you look at the other areas as well, there is a lot happening. So if you look at business enterprises itself, around 14.2 trillion yen are actually invested in R&D. So good opportunity for Indian IT companies to make a mark there. In the interest of time, I believe I won't be able to go in detail, but here are what does it mean to Indian IT service providers. One, of course, if you look at the demographics again, only 2% of the population is immigrant population. the population is decreasing significantly, and there's a direct correlation between innovation, technology, and your working population. So if you go back to those, those charts over there, when Japan was making progress, it had a huge working population. So if they really want to be there, they have to invest in manpower. So manpower is going to come from where? It's basically going to come through immigration. So if you are an IT service provider, I would highly recommend you to prepare your workforce to adopt to the Japanese ways of working. And if you are able to even get 50% of that culture, that ethics into your manpower, and maybe even the language aspects, I think you will be a winner in this market. Again, R&D, as we talked about, one big area, and I would recommend you guys to really look into areas where R&D work is happening and see where you can add contributions. Mergers and acquisitions. Japanese companies are on an acquisition spree. So if you look at the recent acquisitions, a lot of one ways of getting to these patents and innovations is through mergers and acquisitions. So inorganic growth is something which is on top of agenda for most of the Japanese companies. In fact, if you look at the M&A that is happening in Israel and also in the other areas, where for example, say countries like Poland, Ukraine, we are talking about Israel again. A lot of M&A actually happens between Japan and these countries, and that's where we are seeing a lot of action there as well. Again, business partnering, very, very important. How you as an IT service provider are able to understand the requirements of the Japanese economy, the Japanese requirements in terms of R&D and their agenda for growth, whether it is ESG, whether it's climate change, or whether it is any other areas which are on top of their national agenda. Look at that space. And last but not the least, the JPY INR factor. I mean, I was going through the history, and it will be for the first time, probably in the next 3 to 4 months, that it's going to be 50 paisa per JPY, and that is a significant upside for an Indian company to enter into Japan. Never ever has Japanese yen been so attractive for an INR, right? So great opportunities coming up, and in the next say if probably say around 6 to 8 months back, that wouldn't have been a factor, but now going forward, especially with the US dollar gaining strength, and JPY still in its yet to get into the groove, I believe that you have an opportunity to make a mark in this market. So probably we'll have questions later on, because we've got a very interesting topic which is around tax. What are the nuances around tax for IT companies in Japan? So I would probably have Rajat talk about it, and then I'm happy to take on any questions. Rajat, over to you.
Pankaj, thank you so much for this very interesting session. Before we take a deep dive into today's agenda, there are a few points which I would like to, on which I would like to resonate my presentation. Pankaj has given a very nice background about what the opportunity in Japan looks like, and how strong and how good the opportunities could be for foreign service providers, including Indian IT companies, to come and explore this market. And when we talk about coming and exploring this market, then setting up a local base here, setting up a local presence here is of paramount importance. It's very difficult to do complete work outside on a remote basis. You need some kind of a presence in Japan to effectively understand the market, especially because this market is so unique as compared to rest of the world. So it's very important that companies who are serious about market need to have some kind of a presence here. And in today's theme about taxation, we are going to discuss about the onshore-offshore model which typical Indian IT companies adopt to do business here. I would also like to resonate with the opening comments that Anil made, that in the last sessions, there were some concerns about withholding taxes that were raised by most of you. I understand that most of the participants today are from the Indian IT industry. Some of them may be engineers, but most of them are either country heads or CFOs or are heading their own or are heading the projects in their respective IT companies. So I believe that the contents of today's presentation would be interesting to you. This is the agenda for today's presentation. We will be discussing about the outline of the Japanese withholding tax system. Around the onshore-offshore model, we will discuss about a few case studies, and I will help you understand that how withholding tax is triggered in Japan and what can be done to optimize that withholding. If time allows, then we can go into some procedural compliances. But if not, then I would like to spend some time discussing some of the new tax changes which are coming in Japan, especially around the JCT qualified invoicing system. Anybody who is doing business in Japan, this would be important. Are most of you unable to see my screen? I just now got a message from someone.
Yeah, I can see.
I think it's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, Anurag is not able to see. I think Anurag, we are able to see.
Okay, please move ahead. Yes, sorry.
For the benefit of everyone, I think there was another question raised in the chat box earlier also. We will share this screen. We will share the slide deck today through Anil. And both of us remain available. If there were any technological issues, then we are sorry about it. And we would be more than happy to connect with you separately and provide any explanation as required. I think in terms of time, we are still pretty good. We still have around 42 more minutes to go. And my plan is that I will try to complete these slides within 25 to 30 minutes, and then we can keep rest of the time for Q&A and having more interaction. So now let's go forward. We begin by outlining the Japanese withholding tax system. Since most of us are from India, so I would be giving some examples which are closer to our heart and which are easy for us to understand. And I will try to make a distinction between how the Indian withholding tax system differs from the Japanese withholding tax system. I would say that India has got a much more stringent and much more complicated system of withholding tax. And most of the payments which are made either to residents or to non-residents are subject to withholding tax in India. On the contrary, in Japan, there are a handful of payments which are only subject to withholding. And interestingly, fee for technical services are not one of them. There is a domestic provision which says that withholding has to be done upon personal services, but the scope of personal services is rather limited. It only includes payments which are made to self-occupied or self-employed accountants, professional lawyers, architects, etc. But any company which is organized as a GKKK is not subject to that withholding under the local tax law. And interestingly, most of the tax treaties which Japan has negotiated also does not contain any provision for taxing services. On the other hand, India has India being a service-dominated economy where service constitutes its major export, has always tried to tax this revenue stream. So most of the tax treaties which India has negotiated with other countries contains the provision for taxing services. And same is the case with Japan also. Now, when we read the Japanese domestic tax provisions together with the India-Japan tax treaty, then unfortunately, even services which are rendered offshore from India also fall into the scope of withholding. Technically, what happens is that the scope of professional services under the local tax law, which I had explained a bit ago, whose intention was to cover onshore services by self-employed professional, that basically gets expanded, and offshore services which are rendered from India fall. So the definition expands, and the offshore services also fall into its scope. And as a result, what happens is that any service which is rendered by an Indian IT service provider, either completely offshore or partially onshore, partially offshore in Japan, is subject to Japanese tax withholding. The standard rate of tax withholding in Japan for non-resident payments is 20.42%. However, by applying the India-Japan tax treaty and by undertaking some procedural compliances, this withholding can get reduced to 10%. So the key takeaway from this slide is that otherwise Japan does not tax services. If the service provider would have been located in any other jurisdiction, let's say US or Singapore, those services would not be subject to withholding in Japan. However, by application of the India-Japan tax treaty, the services are subject to a 10% withholding. This is a bilateral arrangement, and there is not much which can be done about it. But we will try to explain that what typical models do we see with our clients and in our experience, and how we can optimize this withholding, if not completely mitigate it. We now start getting into details. Japanese tax laws, the domestic tax laws of Japan contain a provision that if the services are provided by a branch of a foreign company, and that branch of a foreign company, it basically constitutes a permanent establishment. So this branch basically falls within the jurisdiction or within the territorial borders of Japan. So there is a provision that payments from one domestic Japanese company to a branch of a foreign company, even an Indian foreign company in this case, will not be subject to tax withholding. The procedures are that this branch has to apply for a lower tax withholding or a nil withholding order from tax authorities. Typically, this exemption certificate is valid for 3 years from the date of being taken. And in principle, it covers all the payments which are made from one domestic Japanese company to the branch, and which relates to the income that is attributable to this branch. I have used some technical words here, and I can understand that a lot of the participants today may not be able to fully resonate with them, at least as of now. As we go further in the slides, I will try to simplify this, and I will try to explain that what is the relevance of the words income attributable to a branch and payment made locally to a branch, or payment made from one domestic corporation to foreign corporation. We will touch base upon these things. We now start taking some case studies. We start discussing some case studies. And all these case studies are based upon the onshore-offshore model of an Indian IT service provider. In the first case study, we assume that the Indian IT service provider has got a contract with a Japanese customer. And the contract is structured in such a way that it can bifurcate between the onshore portion and the offshore portion, and it can even disclose this onshore-offshore split to its Japanese customer. For performing the onshore portion in Japan, the Indian service provider incorporates a local company. It could be a GK or it could be a KK. And the Japanese customer makes direct payment to the Japanese subsidiary for the onshore portion, whereas the portion attributable to the headquarter or the offshore portion is remitted directly to India. In this case, because the first tranche, which is denoted by number 1, when payment happens from the Japanese customer to the Japanese subsidiary, then it is not subject to any withholding, because this payment is made within the territorial jurisdiction of Japan, and this will not be subject to the professional services. However, the portion of payment which is made by the Japanese customer to the Indian entity, Indian private limited or limited company, then that would be subject to withholding. Applying the India-Japan tax treaty, this withholding will be restricted to 10%. In our experience, in this model, or at least in this case, where the onshore-offshore split is clearly shared with the customer, there is not much tax leakage. And the reason is that the effective tax rate of the Indian entity will be approximately 25 to 26% in this case. And the withholding, even on a gross basis, will be only 10%. So the Indian entity should be in a position to fully claim the withholding tax, which is done by the customer in Japan. So this model is one of the most feasible models from a withholding optimization perspective. But the main challenge here is that as a service provider, companies are not comfortable in sharing the onshore-offshore split with their customers, because the customer can very well do a backward calculation and can find out the margins on which the Indian service provider might be operating. So the practical challenge here is that you cannot really disclose all your internal dealings and the split between onshore offshore to the customer. So that's where commercially this model falls flat. We come to the next scenario. In this scenario, there is a contract between the Indian service provider and the Japanese customer. The Indian service provider has incorporated a GKKK in Japan. However, in the customer contract, the portion of the onshore portion and offshore portion is not clearly defined. So all the payment is collected by the Indian service provider, which is the Indian company. So the payment flow is that customer makes all the payment to the Indian company, and then the Indian company pays to the Japanese subsidiary for the portion of the services which it has performed. Typically, in our experience, the Japanese subsidiary here performs routine marketing functions or support functions, and its typical remuneration model is a cost plus 10 or cost plus 15%. So the margin of the Japanese subsidiary in this case is only 15%. Now, from a withholding tax perspective, what happens is that here both the transactions get subject to withholding. One, when the customer makes the payment to the Indian company, then it is subject to Japanese withholding. And two, when the Indian company makes the payment to its Japanese subsidiary for the portion of the support which it had taken, that also gets subjected to an Indian tax withholding. Commercially, this model works fine because here the customer does not know the intercompany, the split of the onshore-offshore between the Indian service provider and its Japanese subsidiary. But from a tax withholding perspective, there is a major leakage because the withholding from customer is done on a gross basis. So assuming a revenue of $100, the withholding would have been done at 10% on the $100. whereas the margin of the Indian company is typically around 30 to 40%, and 30 to 40%, if we do it at a 25% tax rate, then it only comes to around $6 to $7. So there is a leakage of $3 to $4 in this case. Similarly, in the case of when the payment is made from the Indian company to the Japanese subsidiary, there is a 10% withholding at the India level, depending upon the margin of the Japanese service provider. If it is a cost plus 12% entity, then maybe it will be able to basically set off the withholding against its Japanese tax liability. But if it is only a cost plus 6 or 7% entity, then maybe the withholding will not be sufficient enough. The withholding would be higher than the local tax here, and there would be some leakage. Also, it is important to note that unlike India, where there is only tax collected at the federal level, in Japan, taxes are collected at the prefecture level, the municipal level, as well as the national level. So there are 3 or 4 categories of taxes here. And there is some bit of debate around how the foreign tax withholding can be used. Can it only be adjusted against the national tax liability, or can it also be offset against local tax liability? These are also some of the nuances. So this model again is a suboptimal solution because there is tax leakage both on remittance stream number 1 as well as on stream number 2. We now see this is another scenario which we have seen. Here also the mechanics remain the same, that there is an Indian IT service provider. It has set up a 𝐾𝐽𝐺 subsidiary in Japan. And here the contract is between the Japanese subsidiary and the Japanese customer. So as you can see from the green icon, from the green smiling face, when payment is made by the Japanese subsidiary to the Japanese from the Japanese customer to the Japanese subsidiary, then there is no tax withholding because it does not fall into the scope of personal services. However, when payment happens from the subsidiary to the headquarter, then there will be withholding at 10%. In our experience and in running with some numbers, this is an extremely tax inefficient model because of 2 things. One is that there is a lot of withholding in Japan when the remittance is made to the Indian headquarters. And secondly, because all the cash is collected by the Japanese subsidiary, it becomes a very cash-rich company. And then the issue comes that how do we repatriate this excess cash back to the headquarters? Until some time back, India used to have a preferential tax regime wherein overseas dividends were subjected to a preferential tax rate. However, I think it was 2 or 3 years back in the budget, this preferential regime was taken away. So now dividends from foreign companies are subject to the regular rate of tax in India. So in our experience, this again becomes a suboptimal solution from a withholding tax perspective. We now come to a slightly complicated and slightly interesting case. Here, the Indian company operates in Japan through a branch. When the Indian company operates a branch, then both the branch and the headquarters are basically treated as one legal entity. So there is no need for disclosing the split between the onshore and offshore portion to the customer. Sending people from the headquarters to the branch is easy, and collecting money or repatriation between the headquarters and branch are also comparatively easy. They are not subject to withholding. However, it is interesting that Japan legislated the income attribution rules a few years back. And what these rules essentially say is that even if a foreign company is operating in Japan through a branch, still there needs to be proper income attribution which is done to the branch. In this case, even though the branch will be able to take a lower or a nil withholding tax exemption certificate from the Japanese tax authorities, but technically only the portion of income which is attributable to the branch can be remitted by the customer without withholding, and the portion and the remaining portion will still be subject to withholding. So basically, we again fall back on square one, that even in this model, the customer will need a split between the onshore and the offshore portion of the revenue. The onshore portion will not be subject to any withholding, but the offshore portion will be subject to a withholding. We now come to another scenario. Here also the Indian company operates in Japan through a branch. However, the branch here changes its classification from a routine service provider to something more innovative, for example, a distributor or a reseller. So from a transfer pricing perspective, the Japanese branch declares itself as a reseller, which means that it procures the services and the overall package which is to be delivered to the customer first, and then it sells it to the customer. So the branch here takes more roles and responsibilities and more onus on itself as compared to the headquarter. From a customer contract perspective, there is still no difference between a branch and a headquarter. The contract can still be signed at the Indian headquarter by the Indian staff, and it can be performed by the branch, because the branch is technically only an extension of the head office here. And in this case, because all the income will be recognized by the branch at the first place, so all the income will be attributable to the branch. So in this case, there is no withholding when the customer makes the payment to the branch. The only catch in this case is that the transfer pricing model between the branch and the Indian head company and the Indian head office needs to be very clear. The margin which is left behind in the branch is slightly more than the other four scenarios which we explained before, because it is taking the overall responsibility and the entrepreneurial risk with the customer. So here the branch does not just operate on a cost plus 5, 7, or 10%, rather the margin goes up in double digits. But from a withholding tax optimization perspective, in this model, there is no withholding at Japan level, neither when the customer makes the payment, nor when the branch makes remittance to the Indian company. These are some of the scenarios which I have seen in my experience with typical Indian companies which operate in Japan on an onshore model. Also, I would like to point out that within the domestic tax laws of Japan, there is a provision for a foreign service provider which has suffered a withholding in Japan to actually file a tax return and claim refund of the withholding. The catch here is that while the withholding is done on a gross basis, but the tax return here is filed on a net income basis. So coming back to our example, if $100 was the remittance which was made by the Japanese customer to the Indian company in scenarios 1, 2, 3, or even 4, then in that case, the Indian headquarters can actually compute its income on a net income basis, and it can see whether on a net income basis, if it applies the effective tax rate in Japan, which is around 25.58%, then is it less than the gross rate of withholding? And if it is less, then actually it can file a tax return in Japan and claim a refund of the excess taxes. So in a nutshell, while there is no way to totally avoid withholding between Japan and India with respect to technical services, but by structuring your agreements on the lines that we explained in scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4, or the withholding tax refund mechanism, which is explained on this slide, we can at least optimize our withholding, and we can at least optimize that there is less of tax leakage using a combination of one or two of these models. In the interest of time, I am skipping this slide, but this slide contains important provisions that when any payment is made from Japan to India, then what typical withholding tax procedures are required. I would like to remind the audience that if these procedures are not followed, then the withholding in Japan will be 20.5%. Whereas if these procedures are properly followed, then under the treaty, the withholding tax can go down to 10%. This is another new provision which has come in earlier this year. And this is important when a Japanese company is collecting its payment from India. Like in scenario number 2, if you see the payment stream number 2, where the Japanese 𝐸𝐸𝐴𝐸 sub was collecting its service fee from the Indian headquarters, then in that case, this Indian withholding tax procedure will get triggered. Until now, it was possible for any non-resident to collect payment from India without obtaining a PAN number. Technically, a PAN is not required in this case. However, a new procedural provision has come, and certain forms are to be signed electronically and need to be uploaded electronically to the database of the Indian tax authorities. And it could be an oversight or it could be a smart move on part of the Indian tax authorities. But to make this e-filing, one needs to get a PAN number. Only then you can log into the website of the tax authorities and create an account there. So indirectly, any non-resident service provider who is collecting any payment from India is once again now subjected to take a PAN number in India. While it may seem a pretty straightforward process, but having a PAN in India throws open a whole can of worms. And companies should strategically decide on whether they can avoid taking a tax registration in India or not. With this, we are covering the first leg of our presentation, which was around withholding taxes. We now come to the second leg, which is around JCT provisions. While in principle, there is no change in the architecture of the JCT provisions, but starting from 1st October 2023, there is a new qualified invoicing system which will come into play. And this qualified invoicing system has got some ramifications. The main ramification is, or the main change is that until now, the input JCT could be calculated based upon the amount which was paid. In fact, it was technically possible for the service recipient to claim input JCT even if the service provider was not a JCT registered enterprise. However, starting 1st October 2023, this will change. And now JCT would only be admissible on qualified invoices. Qualified invoice in itself is a pretty straightforward topic. It only says that now going forward, any invoice which is issued in Japan needs to disclose all these information. While other things are pretty straightforward, the most important point is that the registration number now needs to be taken. It's ironical, but until now, there was no JCT registration number which was given by the tax authorities to the taxpayers. But going forward, all the companies, even if they are JCT registered, then they will have to once again apply to the tax authorities and get this JCT registration number. And they will need to disclose this number on their invoices. So this issue is more of a matter of your tax technology as well as tax implications. Tax technology, because your invoices now need to be JCT compliant. And it is also a tax matter because it impacts your position as a supplier or as a buyer. On this slide, we have summarized that what are the key issues or what are the main challenges which this JCT qualified system could bring in. Now let's examine a case wherein there is a GKKK operating in Japan and it has got several Japanese suppliers. If any of your suppliers here are not JCT registered, are not issuing qualified invoices, then first of all, you will not be able to claim full tax credit, full input tax credit. There is a transitional measure which is provided. So starting from 1st October 2023, if the input JCT invoice does not come in a qualified format, in a defined qualified format, then input JCT would be restricted to 90%. And as you can see on the table in the bottom part of this slide, this percentage will keep going down and eventually it will be phased out, which means that if your input service provider does not issue a qualified invoice, then you will not be able to take credit of the input JCT. Now let's flip and let's talk about the case where you are making a supply to a Japanese customer. In this case, first of all, the customer will insist you to take a JCT registration number and to start issuing a JCT invoice. If you do not do so, then because the buyer's cost of doing business with you may go up, you stand the risk of either losing the business or discounting your sales price to adjust the amount which the buyer would lose because your invoice is not coming in the qualified format. As action points, we recommend all of you who are running your businesses in Japan to do some kind of a due diligence exercise and to see what your list of suppliers and buyers are. Right now, it is open for all companies to approach their respective jurisdictional tax office and take the JCT registration number. Until 1st March 2023, there are no additional charges for taking the JCT registration number. And the new qualified invoice system comes in effect from 1st October 2023. Please see how your invoicing system works, whether it is capable of supporting the new format of issuing invoices, and whether it is smart enough to see that when an invoice comes from your supplier, then does it contain all the required details in it or not. With this, I close my presentation, and we can now entertain some questions.
Thank you, Pankaj-san and Raj-san for the insightful presentation. So let's go ahead with the Pankaj-san and Raj-san. Let's go ahead with the question and answer session. Yes, Santosh-san.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Thanks for organizing this wonderful this webinar. To be useful. I don't know to whom I should ask it, but I think Pankaj-ji or Rajat-ji both can throw a little light on it. The question is very simple. Mostly about the Indian, because we are talking today about the Indian IT sectors and the business opportunities and the taxation angle. I have one very simple question. The economy, the data, what the Pankaj-ji has presented here, if we look at the core data itself in terms of the monetary value, it is heavily tilted towards the Japan, whether in terms of the investments whether in terms of the ODA or whether in terms of the Japanese firm investment. I have a very simple question about it, that India and Japan have gone through the many bilateral agreements regarding the, like Pankaj said, that in the coming future, the 𝐻𝐵 paisa is going to be 1 year. So there is some swap agreement of the $75 billion between the Japan and India. I'm not seeing the impact of that. That is the first thing. Maybe I'm wrong. And the second point, my second question, related, maybe not related to it, is that if we look at our comprehensive Japan-India digital partnership, because this forum is for the IT people, which was signed in the 2020 in the January, I think, if I'm not wrong. So almost 2 years has passed. Do we have any monitoring or impact or the evaluation data source? Thank you.
Yeah, probably I'll take that. Thanks, Santoshi, for that question. So if you look at the majority of the investments that have been that were promised or rather envisaged, a lot of them are on large infrastructure projects. So what we call as industrial production and even chemicals, IPC areas, right? So they obviously do take time in terms of getting realized. We have started seeing action in terms of transportation, infrastructure around the bullet train and the intellectual know-how around that. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. A large bulk of that amount is yet to be, materialized. And that, of course, would be around, say, a horizon of around, say, 5 to 10 years that you're going to see. So it's not going to be something like it's going to come, immediately. Now, there are certain investments which would be very focused on IT, and they have started, we have started realizing that. Because typically these are not large infrastructure projects, but these are short-term IT enablement projects. And we have started seeing that in the government sector. So if you look at the investments that have been made into the Indian government through these initiatives, especially at the IT investment levels, we've started seeing some action there. But yes, because of the nature of the investments, you're going to see time for it, for it to get materialized. Also, there are certain investments in that package which are for defense, and that's one of the reasons why you don't really see it, as such, because as such it's a protected industry. But yes, I mean, we have started seeing traction there. But good observation, we have still not seen that on the ground, especially when it comes to a forum like this. We have not yet been able to materialize that. Does that answer your question, Santoshi?
I think fair enough. Thank you.
Anybody else? You can raise your hand. Rajat, I have one question regarding the tax one, right? Like, what are the we covered a scenario where the Indian headquarter in India, but what do you call branch in Japan? But how about the reverse, when the headquarter is in Japan and not branch, but it's India is a 100% subsidiary of Japan company?
To my mind, this is rather a theoretical scenario because most of the delivery happens in India. And most of the manpower, most of the engineers or the back-end coding and everything happens, at least in the IT industry, in an onshore offshore model, it all happens in India. And the limited role of presence in Japan is for the customer front-ending or the facing role. where you manage the relationship or you do troubleshooting, these kind of things. So if you have the headquarter here, then we are looking at investment from Japan to India, not from India to Japan. So all major Japanese IT companies do have subsidiaries in India. There are different kind of nuances and different kind of implications which they have to consider. But from the perspective of this forum, I am not sure if that model will really help.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Anybody else has any questions?
Yeah, Anil Raj, I have a question.
Yeah, Prakash, go ahead.
Yeah. This could be for Ponson or Rajasthan. So, for example, when we raise an invoice to a customer in Japan, so we'll be adding 10% tax with the JCT number in our invoice. How about a consultant raises invoice to our company? Do they have to same JCT number?
Starting from 1st October 2023, yes. Forget a consultant, even a grocery seller has to mention the JCT registration number on its invoice.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the system which comes in from 1st October 2023. As IT industry, there is a huge potential right now for the service providers to reach out to small and big businesses in Japan and to help them change their invoicing system or their templates. So the new details can be incorporated into it. I personally am working on a project where typically the invoices are issued by a small store on thermal paper format, but there is a requirement that these invoices now need to be retained. And there is a challenge that how do you still continue using a thermal paper into the new system, wherein at the tax audit stage, it will be necessary to show some of the invoices, etc. Parallelly, there is also another change which is coming in. It's effective from 2024, wherein some of the tax supporting documents need to be maintained in a digital format. There are some industries and there are some kind of invoices which mandatorily have to maintain it in a digital format, and there are some which can use a hybrid. So those are other new changes which are coming in. We have not covered them in today's presentation, but yeah, there are other changes also to consider around.
Yeah, so if we look at, say, the low-hanging fruits, right, this is one of them. I mean, absolute opportunity for Indian service providers to get into the market and come up with that package, which actually where you can provide these quick fixes from a system perspective. So great opportunities there for small, medium, and any scale of operations that change would be required.
Thank you very much. But I assume this JCT number qualified as required for an entity or individual making money Japanese yen more than 10 million?
No, it's required for all payers.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Prem, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Pankaj and Rajat, for the good presentation. I'm not sure it's directly related to IT for now, but my question was more on the M&A space. We see that a lot of startups are coming up in India. Do you see some traction or collaborations happening between the startup and the industry here? If you have some insights, it would be great.
Oh yes, I mean, of course, Rajat deals directly with M&A, but I can give a perspective of the traction that we are seeing in the startups. The Japanese companies look for certain maturity for the startups. So if the startup has already been in the market, it has got a good standing, it has got products or offerings which are actually marketable and which are unique. There's a lot of interest. Of course, the early stage startups, they are going to have some struggle in terms of convincing the Japanese investors. But overall, if we look at the valuations, they are pretty interesting. Japanese are now very willing to take risks, and that we are seeing with, say, startups in Israel. In fact, we have got a unit within our firm called as Catalysts, and they are actually doing tremendous job in getting startups to these large multinational companies, Japanese multinational companies in Japan. So yes, a lot of opportunities, but of course the maturity of Indian startups in terms of preparing them to face the Japanese clients, that is something which probably needs to be polished a bit in terms of presentation, in terms of valuations, and in terms of that kind of value addition that they can get. Rajat, you want to just add on to that?
Pankaj, I think you have summarized it well enough. But we think, in my experience, I think that now we have even progressed one step further, and we are also seeing startups, in Indian startups, which had got some kind of a funding from Japanese companies who are making reverse acquisitions now in Japan. So the maturity level of Indian startups, as well as the risk-taking appetite, is growing on both the sides. It's not just a one-sided story. And especially in the IT sphere, there are tremendous opportunities. And here it's the idea which matters rather than the country or other thing. So yeah, we are seeing a lot of activity around startups.
But it's about the branding of Indian startups, right? Unfortunately, Indian startups are, the way the Japanese look at them is more around manpower supply, right? And that is a correction that we need to do in terms of, branding our startups into the market. Because the moment we talk about startups in India who come to Japan, they come with, say, 50, 100 people, and they're willing to give a service. But if you're looking at a very high-end kind of a transaction where there is some niche technology involved, then probably it's going to be around branding.
Okay, one supplementary question.
Got your point.
Yeah, Santosh, go ahead.
When we talk about the startups, actually, startups means usually the whole world, they lacks the funding. I want to give here example of the Japanese startups because it's known to everyone that startups lacks the fund and manpower and many resources. So here in Japan, Ministry of JICA and many other agencies, they appropriate some funds for the startups to go and conduct the research in India and the developing countries like that. I have experience in that.
Right.
And now I am reversing the same question. The fund, as you said, the transaction cost of doing business in Japan, I think, is probably quite high, if I'm not wrong. Mr. Ranjit can assure it. What kind of Indian startups, such kind of supports are getting from any funds or governments, especially the IT, so that they can come and avoid such huge transactional costs doing business in Japan, so that they can take it. This is just supplementary questions of the paper.
But fortunately or unfortunately, transaction costs are an integral part of an acquisition. And in fact, the importance of due diligence and the importance of having a sound commercial story behind making an acquisition should not be undermined just for the sake of avoiding some initial transaction costs. In the early phases of Indian-Japan bonhommie, we saw some failed transactions. And the primary reason for that was that the companies tried to cut some corners at the diligence stage or at the transactions or when they were in the, spending for the transaction costs. as advisors, we don't recommend for any investor to basically cut corners around proper due diligence. But at the same time, when we talk about a reverse acquisition spree in Japan, then like Pankaj said, that the level of maturity in the Indian market is not sufficient enough, or that is often a point of complaint for the Japanese investors. But in the reverse acquisition side, this is often not the story. If there is an Indian investor which is bold enough to make an acquisition in Japan, then there are some things which it can take for granted. For example, the books which they are reflecting, the story which is reflecting on the books, at least in 95% of the cases, that would be supported by sound backing, or that is what the real business would be about. So there is less risk of frauds and window dressing happening at the face of the accounting documents. So it's just a way of looking, but I think that there is less diligence which is required on these fronts. However, there is a lot of diligence required on the cultural side, that can an Indian investor manage a Japanese workforce or not? Will it be in a position to commandingly giving directions and to understand the whole Japanese ethos of a workplace or not? I think these are other nuances which.
Yeah, so Rajeev, these are obviously the softer aspects, but given the currency now, we are looking at a very attractive valuations for Indians to invest into Japanese companies, which never ever has happened before. So now an Indian investor with that capital can actually just withdraw the dollar value investments and start pumping into the Japan market. And that trend you're going to see in the next few months. And I'm very excited about that trend, where Indians will start making significant investments into the Japan market. And if they are able to invest in R&D and all these areas which we talked about, climate, that's going to be a win-win, an absolute win-win. And these are exciting times. And as a forum here, we should be able to guide and support on what is the art of possible. And I think this group would benefit significantly with those kind of sessions going forward.
Thank you, Pankaj-san, and thank you, Rajat-san, for your insightful talk.
I just have one question. Is it okay? Okay. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your wonderful presentation. So my short question is what is the value proposition and voice of customer, as you might have heard from holistically from Japan?
So we do have a great question. So when it comes to the VOC, right, and especially for an Indian service provider, it goes back to my previous point that currently the Japanese clients are looking at Indian service providers more around scale than, say, strategic value, right? So that's the branding that we definitely need to change. They look at, say, IT as, say, for cyber security, for back office operations, for, say, implementation of an SAP instance, for example. So from a scale perspective, India is definitely up there. In fact, a lot of back office technology implementations are happening back in India through many different service providers. But how can they actually go one notch up and start adding value in terms of, say, some very strategic kind of areas? And that is something which, again, goes back to the maturity of, the sad part is, that sometimes, as an organized, as a group, we must collectively think is, are we really, do we really think about strategy as a value addition, or we are just happy just adding people? So, मैंने 50 लोग लगाए, that itself means that we are happy providing the manpower, we are leveraging the demographics back in India, to get work here. But if you look at the strategic value addition, that is something which we still need to work on.
So thank you so much. So just maybe just a continuation, because I would like to hear from you. Like why do you think we have failed to make India as a brand for some important products and niche products and technology rather than manpower service? What do you think maybe the reasons why we could not do that?
I think it's the mindset, right? I mean, we are very happy to get the scale, and being a country which comes with that scale, it's a very easy sell for us, right? So very similar story in Philippines and China. So we work with the delivery centers in Philippines and China as well, and the brand that they have is again scale. So, but having said that, there are many Indian startups who get picked up in the Silicon Valley. So for them to actually look at Japan as an alternative, it is still a way. I mean, I'm not saying that Indians, generically they lack that kind of a brand, but I'm talking about on an average, a Japanese company looks at Indian IT service provider mainly as a scale for manpower.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pankaj.
Thank you all. I think we have to close the Q&A session because we have overshot the time that we have allocated. So I would like to thank Pankaj-san and Rajat-san, and I would like to invite Jishnu Madhavan, who is also co-founder of the Indian IT Association Japan. So for vote of thanks, Jishnu, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It has been an honor to be part of this wonderful event. On behalf of Indian IT Association, 𝐼TACH, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our Honorable Ambassador of India to Japan, Sri Sanjay Verma. Sorry, he could not come join online with us. And today's speaker, Sri Pankaj Arjunwadkar and Sri Rajat Ranjan, for taking their time and to be with us and giving us the inputs. It was very informative. Also, thank you to the Honorable Ambassador for all his support he has rendered to 𝐼TACH. Because of it we are being able to grow. Thank you, 𝐸_Pulse Japan, for being our media partner and covering this event live. On behalf of 𝐼TACH, I would like to thank all of you present here for taking us time to participate in this event and helping us to make this event a success. Thank you, one and all. We'll see you all in the next event. Arigato. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.